can share it afterwards. We still have some folks joining us. We're just going to give people a few more moments to get in the space and we'll get started. All right, I think we're going to get going. Good afternoon, everyone. It is so good to see you. My name is Ruth Zachrin, and I am the CEO of the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. And I'm really happy you are all here to join us today for this incredibly important conversation that we will be having with our friends and colleagues, Caroline Light and Vanessa Grant from Harvard, which will be facilitated by myself and Alex Pereira from the Coalition. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to take a little bit of CEO license before we get started, just to say how important this conversation is to me. Many of you know that I spent over 25 years working with survivors of domestic and sexual violence prior to coming to my role at the Coalition. And this intersection of firearms and domestic violence and family violence is something that is incredibly important to me. And I'm very grateful to our colleagues for being with us today to talk about this very important issue, which really came about in thinking about the how gun violence shows up here in the Commonwealth, which too often is domestic violence or family violence. And something we've been taking note of recently is the number of domestic violence murder suicides that we have been seeing, the ongoing impact of domestic violence in the Commonwealth. And as we begin Domestic Violence Awareness Month, this feels like such an important conversation to have. And before we get into our program for today, just a couple of housekeeping notes. As I mentioned before, I'm just asking folks to stay on mute during the conversation. We will have opportunity for questions and answers. I'm asking that folks put their questions in the chat, and you're welcome to do so as we go along, so that we can collect those questions and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. And also, if folks want to take a moment just to introduce themselves in the chat so we know who you are, we would welcome you saying your name, what organization you're from. If you're from an organization or community, we would just love to know who is in this space with us. And I also want to say, as I mentioned before, having come from the domestic and sexual violence world, prior to coming to the Coalition about 6.5 years ago, I'm grateful to see some of my colleagues from the domestic violence world joining us today. So this feels like a real full circle moment for me, and I'm grateful for that. And with all that, I would love to turn it over to Alex Pereira from the Coalition.
Thank you, Ruth. Yes, I am Alex, Education Specialist over at the Coalition. So I'd like to start with introducing both of our speakers today, Dr. Caroline Light and then Vanessa Grant. Dr. Caroline Light is a senior lecturer and the director of undergraduate studies at Harvard's program in Gender and Sexuality Studies. Her first book, That Pride of Race and Character, The Roots of Jewish Benevolence in Jim Crow South, shared the stories of Jewish orphans who were raised in institutions that helped lift them up from poverty to prosperity. Her second book, Stand Your Ground, A History of America's Love Affair with Lethal Self-Defense, explores how our nation's ideas around armed citizenship have evolved from an old castle doctrine system to a modern Stand Your Ground law that exists now in most states. A 10-year anniversary edition of the Stand Your Ground book is forthcoming, featuring a new preface by historian Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Congratulations. And then Vanessa Grant is a sophomore at Harvard College studying social studies and human evolutionary biology. She's originally from Pennsylvania and now lives in Lavert House at Harvard. Vanessa's been exploring her interest in law and research. And this past summer, Vanessa worked with Professor Light on projects related to Stand Your Ground, with the Family Mass Murder Project, where she analyzed patterns across cases. As a reminder, Dr. Light and Vanessa will present. We'll follow up with some prepared questions and open it up to questions that we receive from the audience. So please feel free to continue to put questions in the chat. Thank you all so much for joining us. And then I'll pass it over to Dr. Light and Vanessa.
Alex, thank you so much for that generous introduction. And Ruth, I just want to thank you for inviting us to share our insights today. And more generally, I want to thank you and the coalition for your vital advocacy for a safer Commonwealth. I want to thank everybody for being here today and spending time with us at this Lunch and Learn. So, as Ruth mentioned, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I want to mention to everybody that this conversation involves some very disturbing, potentially triggering information, especially if you're a survivor. We value the perspectives and insights of survivors in this space, but I also hope that anyone who feels overwhelmed by any of this information will stop listening if it becomes too much. This is being recorded. We're also happy to provide any of the resources that we shared in this presentation and beyond if you're interested. So I want to say a little bit about how I ended up doing this research. As Alex mentioned, I've spent the past decade plus studying the history of armed self-defense in the United States. And I've done it from the perspective of those communities that are most likely to be targeted by firearm violence. My book on Stand Your Ground laws explores that pernicious fallacy of armed citizenship, this idea that in order to be a good citizen, you have to take up arms in self-protection. I study how people's identities and social locations influence the likelihood of their being targeted by gun violence. So, as you may imagine, this kind of research led me to explore how firearm violence in private spaces, including in the home and within families, often doesn't capture public imagination and public attention as it should. So I was very fortunate this summer to work with Vanessa Grant, who is a brilliant sophomore right here at Harvard, and also my former student. And we worked on several projects related to gun violence and gun violence prevention. Specifically, we partnered with people from GVpedia, and I think Alex might have a link to GVpedia so you can explore further. But this is a very carefully curated online clearinghouse for cutting edge research on gun violence and gun violence prevention. In case you're interested in exploring, they also have a newsletter if you're interested. But they approached us with a project that they wanted some help on, specifically on family mass murder. So I'm going to share our slides so I can tell you a little bit about what that looks like. Hoping everybody can see that okay. So first of all, I just want a quick definition of what this actually means and what we studied. While typically we define a mass murder as four or more people killed in a continuous incident, the family mass murder is it's perpetrated by a relative or member of the family, or it could be also an intimate partner. Our study this summer focused on family mass murders that involved firearms because, as you will see from Vanessa's presentation, guns are used in a majority of these tragedies. Now, in spite of the very high frequency of these incidents and the fact that they are increasing and that they increasingly involve firearms, there is very little research on them. There are also a few common mythologies and misunderstandings that contribute to a profound lack of public awareness about family violence. And I'll just list a few of those before I turn things over to Vanessa, who will share some of the data. First, we tend to believe that the home is the safest place for people, for especially women and for children. Secondly, and relatedly, there's a belief that family mass murders are relatively infrequent compared to public mass murders or mass shootings. This is in part due to the intense media coverage that public shootings receive, which creates the perception of higher frequency there. We seem largely unaware of the sheer scale of it. Family mass murders involving guns comprise over half of these mass public killings. There's also a tendency on the part of law enforcement and our society at large to believe that whatever happens in these private spaces, specifically the so-called sanctuary of the home or within intimate relationships, is somehow not relevant to what we call public safety. We also tend to think of these kinds of incidents that happen in families as a matter of disconnected tragedies, in individual incidents rather than part of a systemic pattern. And then finally, one more misconception I want to highlight is that, in part because of the other misconceptions I just named, we tend to think that there's very little that we can do to prevent these tragedies. This, too, is one of the most tragic misconceptions. So now I'm going to turn things over to Vanessa Grant, who's going to share some of the data to show us just how misguided all of these assumptions are.
So thank you, Professor Light. First, I want to start with some of the work that we did over the summer. Through collaboration with GVpedia, Professor Light and I worked on a data set of cases from the Gun Violence Archive from 2014 to 2024. In our case study, there were 113 incidents with an average of 5 fatalities per incident. I often find this a little bit hard to just conceptualize, so I like to look at it through a map, a visual. So the map that you guys are seeing right now, we produced it over the summer to demonstrate two main themes. The first, the change in firearm fatality in each state from 2014 to 2022. This data was collected from the CDC and was the most recent data available from the organization. This shows that over this 8-year period, every single state, except for New Jersey, had an increase in the rate of firearm fatalities. The second thing I want to point out here is it shows all of our 113 cases of family mass murder that Professor Light and I investigated this past summer. Generally, it shows that in states with increases in firearm fatality rates, there are more family mass murder cases there, with California being the big exception due to their population density. So now, for our study, we consulted the recent studies on family mass murder, particularly those that attended to the use of firearms in the home and among family members. And much of our deep investigation of the 113 cases confirmed what these studies were already investigating and finding out. Most of the rhetoric around mass shootings and homicide more generally focused on incidences that happen in the public realm. But in fact, one study which relied on the Gun Violence Archive, dated from 2014 to 2023, found that over 50% of mass murders occur within the home. Our focus on public tragedies plays into the idea that strangers are the greatest threat to our safety and security. For women and female identifying persons, their largest statistical threat by far are their own, usually male partners, ex-partners, and acquaintances. And going to children under the age of 9, they also face the greatest risk of firearm-related fatalities in the home. In addition to all of that, in the past couple of years, the data has shown that firearms are also the #1 killer of individuals under the age of 18. So, not only are male partners, ex-partners, and acquaintances women's highest statistical threat, but when an intimate partner homicide does occur, a robust majority of family mass murders show that perpetrators are using guns. Beyond this already haunting data point, intimate partner homicides that are committed with the use of a firearm have deadly implications for many others. In any intimate partner homicide situation, if there are other family members within the house, there is twice as large a chance that the offender will harm multiple people than if any other weapon was used. Another study found that guns were used in 75% of family mass murders. This was drawn from data from 2023 to 2003 to 2009. And given the changes in the gun landscape, which have often made guns more accessible, this data tells a dismal but very important story of just how dangerous ignoring family mass murder has been. These can be very grim statistics, especially considering how deregulation with policies such as permitless carry have increased the number of firearms in the population. But there are policy interventions like emergency risk protection orders, or ERPOs for short, that have shown promise in mitigating harm by temporarily removing firearms from people who pose a threat to themselves or others. So let's talk a little bit more about what emergency risk protective orders are. So, what do they do and what does it mean for us? While I think these are really great examples of what policy can do to protect people, I feel like emergency risk protective orders are not really well known. They're also known as red flag laws and are currently active in 21 states, including Massachusetts, as well as the District of Columbia. They allow for a quick civil intervention to temporarily remove firearms away from a person who is at risk of harming others or themselves. This may also ensure that a person who has been identified as potentially causing harm cannot acquire new guns. And so I want to stress this point as ERPOs are a preventative measure, and they do this by making sure that the guns aren't really an option to commit that harm. So, how do emergency risk protective orders differ from regular protective orders and restraining orders? Another policy that many people tend to confuse ERPOs with is a domestic violence restraining order. And while this is very understandable, these policies are very different at their core. So, to start, domestic violence restraining orders are enacted via a criminal law, and there needs to already be at least one misdemeanor crime of domestic violence for this type of restraining order to be granted. In these, we can also see another difference, this time in the scope of who these policies are offering protections. Domestic violence restraining orders are meant to directly address issues of domestic violence, whereas emergency risk protective orders are more widely applicable. For instance, they have been shown to mitigate self-harm and suicide. Over half of gun violence incidences are cases of self-harm, and so this shows that ERPOs can have an impact far beyond family mass murders. Before I continue on to some of my other points, I also just want to stress here again that ERPOs are civil, and a lot of people tend to criticize ERPOs on the basis of due process, but it's really key to understand that since they are a civil recourse and they offer a temporary removal of the gun, this isn't really an issue here. Another key difference between the two kind of policies are access to guns. While emergency risk protective orders are aimed at temporarily removing guns from a person who has shown signs of harming themselves or others, domestic violence restraining orders do not guarantee a temporary removal of those guns. Lastly, domestic violence restraining orders are present in all 50 states plus DC, while ERPOs are only available in 21 states and DC. So now I want to talk a little bit about ERPOs and their efficacy. So the strength of emergency risk protective orders varies greatly state to state in terms of who is allowed to make the petition. So a person who is allowed to make a petition means that they are allowed to go into court and ask that the court removes firearms from a person temporarily. Most states allow for police officers to do so, and in other states, they allow medical professionals, among other relevant groups, to do so as well. Massachusetts currently has one of the strongest ERPO policies, allowing a person's family or household member, dating partners, firearm licensing authority, a law enforcement agency or officer, a healthcare professional, a principal, assistant principal, or a university administrator to file the petition. The majority of the issues with surveying efficacy of emergency risk protective orders is because to do so, you are measuring a counterfactual. And what that means is you're trying to look at what didn't happen. So a lot of since emergency risk protective orders can apply widely to a myriad of situations, a lot of the studies that have come out about the efficacy of ERPOs thus far have focused mainly on suicide. One such study that did focus on suicides, specifically in Maryland, showed that it estimated that for every 11 to 22 ERPOs that have been issued, it prevents one person from taking their own life. And then this goes to a reduction of suicides by 13 to 26%. What this means overall is that through the reduction of the accessibility of guns, there is a concrete result of decreasing loss of lives. Additionally, the study also found that when the emergency risk protective order policies allowed for a wider group of select personnel to be able to make the petition, there are greater gains, meaning less loss of life. Now, I want to end off my section in a very similar manner to how I started off my section with a visual, a map. Yeah, there. A map. Awesome. So what this map is showing us right now is what states in the United States have ERPO laws in effect. I feel like understanding this data becomes just a little bit easier when visually looking at it, especially because I find this very striking because it shows just how much of the United States is not able to benefit from emergency risk protective orders. For many of the states that do not have emergency risk protective orders, they are openly hostile towards the idea of ERPO policies. In the process of doing our summer research, Professor Light and I discovered that in February of this year, Montana enacted a law that forbids ERPOs from being enacted in the state, and citing that it protected the Second Amendment right from encroachment. A common misconception about firearm regulation, especially ERPOs, is that it's punitive and not preventative. And I really want to stress, like, if the one thing you take away from this talk is that ERPOs are preventative, that is the most important thing. With the policymakers of Montana have closed off one method of making their citizens safer. For us here in Massachusetts, it behooves us to do all that we can to protect our ERPO law and make sure that we are protecting the people here as best as we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I'm just going to conclude with a little bit about the evidence that actually so-called private violence in the family is absolutely an urgent public health care concern. I want to amplify some recent research by Geller, Booty, and Krifasi that just came out recently, a few years ago, showing a very direct correlation between so-called private violence and public mass shootings. So in this study, they also used gun violence archive data to show that a majority of the shootings, public mass shootings between 2014 and 2019, were directly related to domestic violence or intimate partner violence. In fact, they found 59.1% of a correlation there. They also found that in 68% of the mass shootings documented in the gun violence archive, the perpetrators killed at least one intimate partner or family member, or else they had a documented history of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. To me, this provides some of the most concrete evidence that what is happening in the so-called private spaces does not stay contained within those private spaces, and in fact can be a direct correlate to public mass shootings, which attract so much of our attention. And I want to reiterate in closing something that Vanessa highlighted with her focus on the emergency risk protection orders, and mentioned that there is quite a lot that we can do on the policy front. There is compelling evidence that ERPOs are a preventive measure against self-harm with firearms. When we think about national firearm-related deaths, over half of them are self-inflicted. And in fact, about half of family mass murders also involve suicides as well. And I want to just amplify that correlation there too, that these policy interventions have been shown to be preventive, to have a strong effect on saving life. So some of the things I want us to be thinking about as we enter the month of domestic violence awareness, I want to hope that it extends beyond just the month of October, that we can think about domestic violence throughout the year because it has a massive impact on public health and safety. I want to highlight the fact that our Commonwealth has among the strongest emergency risk protection orders in the nation, and that we need in this moment to be protecting these policies that have been shown to save lives. I also want to indicate that in a moment where our political polarization is really quite powerful, and has a centrifugal effect sometimes on our feelings, is that we push back against that by elevating a communal ethos of care. And I believe that is the great work that the coalition is doing. So I will end with that, and I welcome any questions about this specific work or its larger implications for public health and safety. Thank you.
Yes, thank you both so much for that informative presentation. We'll now begin to transition over to our prepared questions. And also, please continue to post any questions that you all have in the chat, and we'll get to them. First question kind of already touched upon it a little bit, but could you both expand on how you both got involved with this work?
Do you want to go first, Vanessa?
Sure. Um, I will talk a little bit about my experience in high school. I was very involved in learning about the legal field and especially the Second Amendment right. So when I was coming in as a first year last year, I took Professor Light's class and I learned a lot more in depth what the landscape really was with the Second Amendment and specifically stand your ground laws. And from this, I just realized that this was such a rich kind of field that needed more study. And so when the opportunity presented itself to learn more, not only for myself, but then hopefully also be able to share information and knowledge about this topic with others, I wholeheartedly agreed to work with Professor Light.
And I have benefited significantly from Vanessa taking my class and also agreeing to be my research partner this summer. So we're continuing to work together. I'm a historian, and so many folks will ask me how it is that I have, I'm trained to work in archives, to look at the past. Rather than really focus in the contemporary moment. But what I couldn't ignore when I was doing my historical research on armed citizenship, on justifiable and excusable homicides in the United States in that long history, what I couldn't ignore were the reverberations into our present. For instance, the kinds of identities, social locations that make people more or less exposed to the consequences of deregulation, deregulated or lightly regulated firearms in our nation. If you look at the data, it's very much skewed in terms of where those harms are and who is most likely to become a target of firearm violence. And for me, as I'm situated in a program in women, gender, and sexuality studies, you can't ignore the very long-standing histories and traditions around gender violence. The fact that women, especially mothers, wives, have historically had less access to the tools of self-defense against their largest statistical threat, which, as Vanessa mentioned, it's not dangerous strangers. That's a mythology. Women's largest statistical threat are their own intimate partners and exes. So I think one thing I've tried to tackle in my work is that mythology of stranger danger, the notion that you need to be armed and ready to protect yourself and your home from dangerous strangers, it represents a statistical mythology. Really, the people that women are most likely to face danger from are the people who should love them and should care for them. So anyway, there's a lot of reasons why this work has resonated for me and why I've turned a bit and pivoted towards more contemporary data. And it feels so urgent right now.
Right. Thank you both for sharing that. And kind of to the next question kind of expands on that final point that you were touching on. Why has family mass murder remained so stubborn in society, and why don't we know more about it?
It's sort of, it's a great question. I think there are a lot of different reasons. One, I will say, is that there still is this mythology that our homes are the safest place. This misplaced belief, we see it play out in a lot of advertisements for firearms, for instance. I did study for a while the kinds of advertisements that firearm manufacturers are leveling specifically at female consumers. And those advertisements tend to emphasize stranger danger, the idea that there could be someone lurking behind the bushes or in a dark parking garage. And they're designed to make you fearful, because fear is one of the greatest motivators towards consumption. If you're fearful of something, you will go buy something to help make you feel less fearful. But it isn't grounded in the data. The data show time and time again that really what's happening is that women and female identified people are more likely to be harmed by people they know, their own acquaintances, and their loved ones. And that's something that has proved really a resilient mythology in our culture. It continues. And so I think that's one of the main reasons. There's also, I think, a lot of resistance to getting involved in so-called private issues, right? And maybe Vanessa wants to talk about this more, but one of the things that really was really stubborn and difficult for us this summer as we were trying to code these tragedies, these 113 really terrible tragedies, we were using media searches to try to learn more about what actually happened. What we discovered is it's very hard to know and to track the extent to which domestic violence or family violence is involved, because folks are afraid to talk about it. And so we worked really hard to look and read between the lines of sort of coded references to, a neighbor saying, for instance, this was a really nice family, but, they kind of kept to themselves. It seemed like the woman didn't want to talk to us when her husband was around, or things like that, that can indicate that there was a deeper problem that is linked to systemic domestic violence, gender violence, etc. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just add to that very briefly. When you're looking at the media records and kind of what's happening out of these families, and you're trying to parse out what is happening, there's just such a variety in what you're going to get, with some cases only receiving maybe two articles, and then other cases they're going to get mentioned by the president at the time. And because of this variation, it's very telling to see like what society kind of hooks onto, latches onto, because certain cases really just do appeal to the public audience and the public imagination of what gun violence is. And then when it comes to the particulars of actually coding the cases and looking for domestic violence or intimate partner violence, all of these studies, including what we did over the summer, we always have to add the caveat if it's documented DV, or this is what we could tell. If you really look in depth, or what we can kind of extrapolate from the data, it's very likely that more of these cases are related to that kind of private violence that DV and IPV kind of is wrapped into. And so it's one of the very hard aspects of doing this work, of trying, like, where's the line? Like, what can we say? Like, this is what we're going to classify as DV. Just because we can't necessarily say that everything is DV if we don't have that hint, at least
Mm-hmm,
in the record.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for this. I'm going to jump in with some questions as well. And again, we'll have opportunity. I'm seeing a couple questions come up in the chat, but please do add some more as you're thinking of them. And just, I'm so grateful for this conversation. This is so critically important. We know that this is the kind of violence that is showing up here in the Commonwealth. We know we need to do more. And as we talk about here at the Coalition all the time, we can't address gun violence without talking about domestic violence. And we can't address domestic violence without talking about guns. So the two are just so incredibly intertwined. And just the other piece I wanted to bring in, one of the other recent statistics is now that the highest cause of death for pregnant and postpartum people is homicide. most often perpetrated with a gun as well. So, this is an issue that just permeates so many parts of our society, but at the same time, we really have a hard time talking about it. And Professor Light and Vanessa, you both touched on this in your presentation, but I want to go a little bit deeper. And just to bring everyone here on the screen into a conversation that we had preparing for today, we talked about the frustration of seeing media coverage of DV homicides or family mass murder, where folks talk about it. It was a private issue. There's no threat to the general public. And that's a hard thing for me to hear because I'm not sure how these families aren't a part of the general public. And at one point, are we going to stop seeing these things as isolated private incidents and instead an ongoing pattern that shows to us some deeper issues that we really need to address? I want to get into those deeper issues and ask you both to reflect on what needs to change in our culture to make this conversation different, to really get at some of the root causes and what's going to prevent such violence from happening.
Mm. I love this question in part because it's so hard. It's so hard to imagine otherwise. One thing I'll signal is that it's like it's baked into our national DNA to believe in this dichotomous relationship between public and private. I really, as you were speaking, I kept thinking this really is very much embedded in our national consciousness that what happens in so-called private space is sacrosanct. And for some people, not all people, certainly, but that we don't want to get involved. We don't want to know what's going on with the neighbors if it seems like something's amiss. So part of it is, like I said, when I think about a community of care and ethos of care, I think about building community around shared safety, being there for each other, being present, being proximate. And I think that's a really important way to resist that. And the other thing about this public-private dichotomy, it's very gendered. It's not just accidental that there's an assumption that women and children are somehow safer in the home, which we know from the data is not true, right? There's a reason why I feel like a lot of gun manufacturers are trying to sell firearms to women based on stranger danger, based on fears that there could be somebody lurking in the parking lot who will take your car away and steal your children or something like that. That these are statistically very unlikely. And Ruth, I can't remember if you mentioned it before, but I know that our friends at Harvard School of Public Health did a study a few years ago that came up with the alarming statistic that having a gun in your home, if you are someone who is a survivor of domestic violence, if you are living in a violent situation in your home, having a gun in that home, regardless of who it belongs to, makes it 5 times more likely that you will die by that gun. And I think that alarming statistic needs to be spoken more frequently. We need to be better aware of the data showing that more guns in the household are not making us safer. It's just the opposite. Do you want to add anything to that, Vanessa?
Just really quickly, I want to echo everything that Professor Light has touched on today. But also, I want to add that there has been this statistic where, for all the public mass shootings that have happened, there have been correlations where domestic violence has also influenced the perpetrators in even the public mass shootings happening in the country. And so I find it very alarming when we've already established that connection where the private violence within the familial unit is it's so relevant to the violence that's happening in public. And I feel like it's very important for people to hear this information to see where it's like, oh no, there is this very big connection, and we can no longer have that divide if we really want to make progress in this issue.
There's another thing I want to add that you just made me think of. there are other opportunities for intervention that have empirical data proving that they can actually possibly work. One is on safe storage, and
Mhm.
I mostly learned about this from another wonderful former student who was in our class, who Dylan, who has done some wonderful work on behalf of survivors, and around safe storage, is that if you are going to have a firearm in your home, you need to secure it and make sure that it won't fall into the hands of children, for instance, or someone who's experiencing a crisis. So part of this really is about it is about securing our guns and being more responsible with them. As more and more guns are circulating into more and more hands, there are so many missed opportunities to intervene in ways that do not encroach on this idea of a Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms.
Thank you for that. And I just also want to highlight a comment in the chat too, which notes that the majority of shootings are actually involving folks who do know each other. So just underscoring what you've been talking about. And that's something that, we feel like part of our role at the coalition is to make sure folks understand that. We know that DV and guns are a uniquely lethal mix. The latest statistics is that upwards of 75 women lose their life every month in this country because of being shot and killed by a current or former partner. Like, this is a very pervasive issue. And again, you touched on this a bit, but also just thinking about other policy remedies. We're seeing a lot of harm happening on the federal level, and I would be remiss if I didn't say that out loud. Just in this recent, the big bill that came out, which, reduces access to supports like Medicaid, which is the largest single payer of behavioral health services, and also pays for a lot of domestic violence programs to provide services like mine did. And so we're seeing a disruption of that. At the same time, the same bill increases access to certain kinds of weapons. So we talked about obviously ERPOs and safe storage, but policy wise, locally, federally, anything else you want to highlight that helps us get at prevention and making sure these kinds of incidents don't happen?
Wow. Well, that's a lot. I do think, okay, so the federal terrain is not looking good, and I do not have a lot of optimism that it's going to get better. I think the cuts that you were just naming, Ruth, are going to continue. And also, what it looks like is that our regulatory landscape is crumbling under our feet as well. So I believe North Carolina just became the 30th state, and if I'm wrong, someone correct me, fact check me, the 30th state to adopt a permitless carry, or what many people call the quote constitutional carry, which means there's no requirement for a license, there's no requirement for any safety training, no, practice to make sure that if you have a gun, you know how to use it and you can use it safely and you can store it safely. So it basically removes all of those small protections that were once in place across the states. There's a potential that the federal government may impose a constitutional carry as well, and also a stand your ground law. These have been kind of on the docket, I would say, for a few years now, and I don't know if they will come to pass. But this leads to really what I hope our intervention can be. Massachusetts obviously is a leader in gun violence prevention. We're doing it very, very well. There are also some other states in New England that are working really hard to stem the tide of gun violence, um, injuries as well as fatalities. So I'm a big fan of coalition, especially in times of constrained resources, um, uh, political polarization. I wonder what it would look like if we had a little bit more collaboration among those states that in the map that you showed, Vanessa, where there's a critical mass of states that are, for instance, have ERPOs and are strengthening their ERPOs, that have safe storage laws, et cetera, that have bans on ghost guns. These are very common sense policies that I believe a lot of gun owners support as well. What would it look like if there was a coalition of states that amplify gun safety over an unfettered an interpretation of the Amendment that means unfettered access to firearms for anybody? So that's something that I believe could have some traction. because I don't think it's going to get much better on the federal front. In fact, I think it's going to get worse.
Thank you for that. I think what I'd like to do is also just touch on a couple of things that are coming up in the chat. One directly relates on what you just said, and hopefully we'll be able to get to all of the questions. We also have a call to action at the end, so folks can stick around with us for a bit. We'll get to some Q&A and then something you can take with you at the end. But I'm just noticing a comment about it really gets at that piece around safety and the scapegoating of trans folks right now as being inherently unsafe, and the proposed restrictions on trans folks being able to access firearms. And I have a couple thoughts about that myself, but Professor Light and Vanessa, is there anything that you also wanted to add to that conversation?
I have found that discourse around trans and non-binary people as a specific source or an intensive source of firearm violence to be a diversionary tactic, I would say, by a kind of extremist worldview that wants almost no regulations of firearms except on minoritized populations of people. For me as a historian, that reverberates for me. It sends me back into the mid 20th century and earlier, where more extremist forces of a more retrograde vision of our democracy that's based on exclusions rather than universal rights, et cetera, that those folks would very commonly point to different populations of people who are more likely to be targeted by firearms than to be the perpetrators of firearm violence. So, for instance, activists on behalf of civil rights were regularly criminalized and prohibited and excluded from their Second Amendment rights because extremists, white supremacists would label them as being the source of gun violence rather than its targets. I'm seeing a very similar kind of discourse happening today, which is meant to distract us from the actual sources of firearm violence.
Yeah. If I could add one thing, what I also learned from Professor Light as I've been working with her is it's the reversal of who's seen as the victim. So it really goes to the type of rhetoric that we're using and that we're hearing in society today, where we need to be very careful about who we're actually painting to be the aggressor and who is the victim. And so, as Professor Light has said, trans people and non-binary people, they are part of a wider marginalized coalition of groups who are traditionally the targets of this violence. And when we kind of play into this rhetoric of, no, they're dangerous, or like those kind of stereotypes of what these marginalized people are, it's very dangerous for flipping the narrative and confusing the whole water. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I so appreciate your responses to that. And we've seen statistics about actually trans folks being targeted by
Mhm.
violence and being victimized. And we've seen a very high rate of gun violence targeting trans folks.
Mhm.
And so that's something I wanted to lift up in this conversation too. And as you know, we always say, having conversations based on data and facts is incredibly important. Um, I want to get it. There was a technical question. I don't know if you have information about the kinds of guns or the types of guns that are usually involved in domestic mass shootings.
Yeah, I
Imagine that might.
appreciate that. I see Dr. Weiser is here and has asked that question. It's a great question. We really tried over the summer to code the types of firearms that were being used where we could. Unfortunately, most media accounts didn't provide that information for us. We did look at court cases for when the assailant survived the incident. And those would often provide that information. And Vanessa will correct me if I'm wrong, but the ones that we were able to find tended to be handguns more often. I don't think that will be surprising to you, but more often than not, they were handguns. But that's another area of where the data is largely missing, and it would be good to have from a policy standpoint. Yeah. Is
Terrific.
that right?
Thank you for
That is
that.
correct. Yeah.
Okay, okay,
Yeah.
good,
Yeah.
good. I was paying attention.
This is a question that comes up that's really more around practice. It's something that I have puzzled on, and I think other folks on the screen have as well, in terms of the delays that can happen after someone gets restraining order around firearm confiscation. And it's a sort of a longer question, but um, if the practice does not always get at removing guns in a timely way after an order is issued, what can be done or what conversations are happening around making sure that that gets tightened up more?
I think one thing is that there needs to be an education campaign that accompanies the policy. So, like, safe storage doesn't do a whole lot of good if people don't know about it. So you need medical practitioners, you need law enforcement, you need administrators and colleges and schools to be on the front lines of providing guidance and information about these policies so that they can be enacted, so that people know what they're entitled to and what they're allowed to ask for if they feel unsafe. And most importantly, so that our law enforcement can actually assist in making sure that this happens. I think also we need to figure out ways, and this is where it's really important to have gun owners involved in these conversations, is to really talk about what it means to be a good friend, a good neighbor. And when you identify that someone you love and care about is struggling, for whatever reason, that we don't stigmatize a conversation that starts with, do you have access to firearms? Are they secure? Do you need someone to hold on to them for you while you go through what you're going through? And unfortunately, our current sort of political circumstances, especially around firearms, makes it very difficult to have those kinds of conversations. So I know that's not a complete answer, but I think the start is really just popularizing these kinds of conversations and making sure that the education gets out there in terms of what the policies are and what we have access to. Do you have anything to add, Vanessa?
Yeah, real quick, Professor Light has also talked a little bit about this one unit in Washington State, and
Yes.
Washington State also, they have an URPA policy in place, and they're very effective in how they employ it, and they're very effective in how it's enforced. And so what this team allows to do is they connect different agencies that are all, they have relevant parts in the process of temporarily removing the guns and ensuring that the URPA is enforced. And so, because of this really good collaboration and communication at the organizational level, they're really able to ensure that that protection is given as soon as as it's needed.
Great point.
Terrific. And
I put it in the
yeah,
chat. It's absolutely amazing. There's nothing else like it in the nation that I know of, but they follow a case from start to finish to make sure that those guns are actually temporarily taken, put in a safe space, and somebody follows up to make sure that that happens.
and there's been some great articles in the Trace written about this as well. And so we can pull that information. We always send a follow-up email to folks after one of these lunch and learns so we can provide some of those articles too, because it has been really interesting. And just even the piece you talked about, the education being so important. And I'm seeing, a comment too about education about different policies. There's the point of the policy, but the education around it can be really protective as well. And so I'm appreciating that comment in the chat too. And given that we are about to run out of time, I'm going to combine our prepared last question with a question that I saw in the chat, which is really about next steps. It's about what you want folks to take away from this. How can people get involved? How can people support your work? And if you could reflect on that a little bit, and then I'll also finish with an action step that we have from the coalition as well.
At the risk of kind of reiterating what you may be saying, I think right now we need to be very proactive and protective of what we have here in our Commonwealth. Massachusetts, as Vanessa said, has some of the most effective firearm safety laws. Um, for instance, we have it's called an act modernizing firearm laws. And not only does it provide for a stronger ERPO that includes people like school administrators and mental health care practitioners, it also bans ghost guns. So this is something that is, I think, about to be or is currently under assault from organizations of gun rights groups that see have a kind of, I would say, extreme uh, interpretation of the Second Amendment, implying that any kinds of safety regulations are unconstitutional. I disagree. I think that it's absolutely essential that we protect life, and that means the lives of gun owners too, right? So I would say pay attention, stand up, be ready to advocate for these laws that the coalition and other advocates have been fighting so hard for, right here in the Commonwealth, and really push for coalition around these interventions.
Vanessa, anything you want to add?
Well, I feel like that was put beautifully, and I would just want to stress the importance of education as everyone is kind of just hitting on right now, where do things like this, get yourself involved in the community in the conversation and just learn because you don't know what you don't know. And so I feel like this is wonderful, and being able just to learn more about the this topic is just like one of the best things you can do.
Well said.
Thank you so much. And I'll just say really quickly, because we really got at the importance of this, we do have strong laws here in the Commonwealth that the piece of legislation we got passed a little over a year ago actually got us an A grade from GIFR. It's one of the national gun violence prevention organizations because of the strength of our gun laws. We know there's going to be a question on the 2026 ballot looking to repeal the law that we just passed. And we are committed to making sure we protect this legislation and keep the work of keeping our community safe from gun violence going in the Commonwealth. So I just put a website in the chat for folks to learn more about this campaign to protect the legislation. The committee is called Vote Yes for Safe Massachusetts. So you can learn more there. Would love for folks to check out the website and get involved. There's some links in the website if you would like to get more involved. And as we have now 2 minutes left in our hour together, I would just like to say to Professor Light, to Vanessa, my sincere gratitude for the work that you are doing, for the partnership that you have with us. It means a great deal to me as someone who has walked into this conversation about gun violence after years of work with survivors, after sitting with children in the aftermath of a domestic violence homicide, to be able to connect all of these dots and understand that this is the complexity of the issue and the things that we can do when we come together to keep not just our communities safer from gun violence, but our homes safer from gun violence. So, on behalf of all of us at the coalition, just a sincere thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Alex, and thank you so much for the incredible work that you do. We are very
And, thank,
grateful.
and thanks to all of you for being with us today. Thanks to Alex for all your work putting together today's program. It's a team effort. And we are grateful to everyone in our coalition community for supporting this work. I hope everyone has a really good day today.
Thank you.